So the reality is that our DNA is ancestrally not grandma and grandpa. It's 200,000 years old, between 200 to 250,000 years old. So our reality is a tiny blip in time versus the reality that we're designed for. So imagine the habits of 200,000. Modern agriculture is 10,000 years old. Farming, right? That's also a blip. The 190,000 years prior to that, those are the habits and the environment and the food and the sun exposure and everything that we are designed and wired for, which is why we still learn about, oh, we have this response because cavemen used to be scared of wolves attacking them in caves. Yeah, because we still are wired for those behaviors. They happen for so long. So given that context, drop it in today's reality, everyone's going to be sick unless you're doing everything right.
Welcome back to the Energy Blueprint podcast. I have a very interesting episode for you today with Kashif Khan, who is the founder of the DNA Company. All right, Kashif, welcome to the show. So first of all, let's talk about the difference between genetics and functional genetics, or genomics and functional genomics. How do you distinguish between those two?
So genetics is most likely what a lot of people are familiar with and what they think is possible, which is, let me run a test, find out what version of each gene I have, like the study of the gene version, the variant, if not variant, the normal version, and what propensity or disease does that point to. So I get something that says I have an 80% chance of Alzheimer's, and good luck, right? That's genetics. So that's where the science needed to start there. Like, let's understand what all these genes do, and let's start to research them. And the human genome was only fully finished being sequenced this year, or last year, I should say, 2022, right? And so now functional genomics is, we already know enough about what each gene does. How do we consider the epigenetic habits of lifestyle, environment, nutrition, and take us away from this probability or propensity based, you got an 80% chance of Alzheimer's, to why did 20% not get it? What do I do? Like, how do I be that person? Right? I don't want to just walk around and wait. So, and that layer of research didn't exist because the geneticists were sitting in one silo studying the genes. Clinicians were over on the other side helping people. Nobody filled the gap. So functional genomics is exactly that. Genes reported in the biological pathways that they actually occur in the body, as opposed to this gene, this gene, this gene, which is not the way the body works. There's systems that we already understand. And then the epigenetic factors that pull you in either direction, that turn the dial on, are you in the 80% or are you in the 20%? And now all of a sudden it's very actionable. You can now build this personalized playbook. And when you hear about Alzheimer's, it's not about worrying, it's about having an action plan and not getting it, right? So that's where we're now at with the science.
So if someone has the BRCA gene for breast cancer, should they cut off their boobs to prevent breast cancer?
So that's a perfect example. So BRCA is this scary 4-letter word for women. And even today, you ask most doctors, what does BRCA mean? And they will tell you breast cancer risk. It has nothing to do with breast cancer risk. And that's exactly why genetics on its own is broken. BRCA is a tumor repairing gene. So if, God forbid, you got breast cancer or any kind of cancer, it goes and fixes it. It also repairs damaged DNA. It also repairs cells. It's a repair tool. It's going through the body looking for broken things to fix all the time. Now, if you have a certain version of BRCA, you don't do a good job of repair, which means, again, God forbid, you got cancer, breast cancer, you're less likely to survive because you don't do a good job innately of repair without any other intervention. That still didn't answer the question, why did it happen? I wasn't born with it. I'm not born with prostate cancer, breast cancer, ovarian cancer. Why did it happen around the age of 50-ish, right? So some women, and we can determine this genetically, make a lot more estrogen in their hormone pathway. And this is what we see about the pathways and biology in which the human actually acts, as opposed to a gene and a gene and a gene. The hormone cascade is already known. Progesterone flows into testosterone, flows into estrogen. There's some variability there. And then there's estrogen metabolites, right? Some women just fill that estrogen bucket a lot more. Step 1 of 3. estrogen dominant, as we call it. In that estrogen dominance, some women in the metabolite that they converted into before they have their menstrual cycle might have a toxic version. There's three options. 2-hydroxy, as they call it, is a clean, pure, that's the what you want as a metabolite. And then 4 and 16 are toxic, 16 being more toxic than 4. So now if you are estrogen dominant and you're going into the 4 or 16 pathway, you're making a toxin, then you need to look at step 3. How well do I detoxify this toxin? Your glutathione pathways, your antioxidative pathways, and there's some interesting things going on with you, by the way, there we're going to look at. How well do I get rid of this stuff? So if you're estrogen dominant, estrogen toxic, detox pathways don't work, there's a monthly load of inflammatory insult every single month. Then you get into menopause and you don't have a menstrual cycle anymore, and you're not getting rid of it. And you're going into a hormone replacement therapy and loading the estrogen, or you spend 15 years on a birth control pill and you loaded the estrogen, or you don't understand the endocrine disruptors and hormone mimics in your environment, the chemicals and plastics and phthalates and all this stuff that as they enter your body treats them as more estrogen, filling that estrogen toxic bucket, right? That's where the epigenetics come in. So you might have this profile, you might have the wrong epigenetic exposures, and then you might be in menopause and no longer have a menstrual cycle. And your body's like, what do I do with all this toxicity that's going to damage all my organs? It goes and stores it in fat to protect you. And this is why some women actually get stuck with weight plateaus, because they're so toxic. It's not actually the fat, it's the toxicity for which the fat is being used to store it and protect you. Where do women have fat? In their breasts, hips and breasts, essentially, right? So now you have the why behind, why did I get so much inflammation that led to cellular degradation and eventual cancer developing in this particular area? That's the why. And this is the point when BRCA is now supposed to get to work and fix that cancer that has been developed. And by the way, if you cut your breasts off, you didn't get rid of the fire. You still have the estrogen dominance, toxicity, no detox. You're just going to get ovarian cancer. And guess what's now being said genetically? BRCA is also linked to ovarian cancer, right? Without any of the functional insights into what's actually happening in the body.
Right.
Because the intention of genetics is, what drug can we make? What pill can we make? It's not how do we prevent the disease in the first place. So now name a chronic condition and you can speak to it at this level if you look at it functionally.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's interesting to see body parts as expendable, Thank God I'm not in that paradigm and somebody didn't tell me that I was at risk of penile cancer, or, it's like, obviously if somebody tells you you're at risk of brain cancer, it's like, well, should I cut out my brain? And, it's a crazy paradigm to think this way. And yet it's nobody's fault. It's at the individual level, it's the fault of a culture that has overemphasize the importance of specific genetic variants as determinants of disease, instead of as speaking about them in the proper context as increasing relative susceptibility relative to somebody else with another variant. So I think the obesity gene is a great example of this. For decades, we've had media articles published about, obesity gene this, obesity gene that, and yet if you actually understand the context, if you study the science around obesity, you realize, well, really no humans were obese prior to like 100 years ago. Obesity was this extraordinarily rare occurrence among traditional living humans. Genetics haven't changed profoundly in the last 100 years. Only lifestyle and the environment has changed. And obesity rates have skyrocketed in a few generations. It can't be genetics that are the cause of this. It is, of course, a disease of lifestyle. And yet, if you don't understand that context, somebody talking about the obesity gene could make you think, oh, if I have that gene, I'm destined to be obese. When in fact, it's really just saying, in the context of an obesogenic world, an unnatural world filled with a Willy Wonkian treasure trove of temptation that is totally unnatural for the human species to exist in. Some people will be more prone to becoming obese relative to some other people, which doesn't mean a whole lot. But anyway, do you have any thoughts that you want to
Yeah,
add?
I mean, there was a story that just came out on 60 Minutes where there was a healthcare advisor to the Biden administration that came out on 60 Minutes saying that obesity is there's a 50 to 80% likelihood of being obese if your parents are obese. It's purely genetic and it has nothing to do with environment and lifestyle. That's literally what was said by the White House on 60 Minutes last month. No surprise that Ozempic is being launched in the same month,
Uh,
which is a major
explain to
weight loss.
explain to people what Ozempic is.
So Ozempic is essentially it inhibits the desire for food and makes you lose weight. And it's a major weight loss drug that every celebrity is now using. Khloe Kardashian doesn't look like herself anymore. And now it's sold out everywhere. And it was originally designed for diabetics and insulin response, and now it's being used as just like a fat loss drug. So what really is going on, yes, there are genetic profiles that point to greater propensity of weight gain, etc. But without the lifestyle load, it doesn't happen.
That's right.
So we now know we live in a reality where everything sucks. The food sucks, the chemicals suck, the environment sucks, the pesticides in our grass, the thing that I clean my desk with, my laundry detergent, it's all horrible. Right? So now, what am I going to get? What problem am I going to get? That's what your genes are going to point to. Which biological function doesn't work?
Right.
What job does my body not do well? So, for example, FTO gene signals satiety of the gut. So, how well does your stomach tell your brain I've eaten enough? If that doesn't work well, and you also have a poor insulin response, which we can determine genetically, and you eat bread for every meal, you're probably going to gain a lot of weight, right? You're never going to finish that loop of satiety. You're not going to get there. The MC4R gene determines satiety of the palate. How well do you get satisfied in your mouth? And this was a survival mechanism of our ancestors seeking out variety, right? So the only thing that causes a satiety is variety. You need soupy, salty, crunchy. You need sour. You need soft. You need everything. So that it's not that, oh, I have this gene, now I can't get satiety. No, go eat like some trail mix. Have a nut and a piece of cheese and a grape and create the satiety, right? Just like when you sip on Thai food, it's that wow factor because you're getting everything you need. Hormones are the same. There's some women that like, I'm stuck. I don't know what to do. And it's if you're estrogen dominant, your body's just much more likely to have cellulite, store fat because you're fertile, right? You're designed to be that ideal fertile woman. That's what's going on there. And when you get into menopause, the opposite can happen. When there's low estrogens, you end up storing fat. So all we're saying, here's the problem: weight. There's not one single answer genetically to why you have that problem. There's enough threats where everyone's going to have that problem. Now, if we can pinpoint what job your body doesn't do well, that's the area where you need to focus, right? Supplement that, adjust that, turn the dials on the load you can't handle for that. And then your problem goes away. It's not an obesity problem. It's not a weight problem. It may be a serotonin problem. I lean on food as a coping mechanism because my brain doesn't work. So that's where I need to focus. And that's really how you can be more functional about this stuff.
Got it. I think that's an important point. We should maybe come back to that and continue to emphasize that throughout this podcast. I want to zoom out for a second and express some of my general skepticism of this whole area. And I think, this segues very naturally on the back of what we're just talking about, kind of this, in general, this problem of overemphasizing the importance of genetic variance in as being a determinant of disease risk. But the context here that I think is important for people to grasp is, and forgive me for playing devil's advocate here in the context of interviewing you about your stuff, but this is my position and my perspective on the landscape of human health. I have a strong bias to recognize that over 80% of the chronic disease burden right now is in the modern world is driven by diseases of nutrition and lifestyle. Mm-hmm. And only a tiny portion of diseases are actually true genetic diseases. So this landscape of the vast majority of chronic disease that and morbidity that people are suffering from is driven not by their genetic variants, but driven by their nutrition and lifestyle and their environment, mainly their choices of what they're choosing to put in their bodies and how they're choosing to use their brains and bodies. And we also, that. So I think it's important to just to ground all of this in a context where we're saying the importance of nutrition and lifestyle is the main factor dictating disease risk. We also know that there's been this in the last few decades, this transformative change in how we view genetics from genes as dictating our destiny kind of towards the science of epigenetics, and realizing that actually our behavioral choices, our lifestyle factors, our nutritional choices, our environment, what we have going on psycho-emotionally is actually influencing the expression of our genes, and whether certain genes are getting turned on or off, or to what degree they're being switched on and off. And we realize, like, actually this whole stuff about our behavior and our lifestyle is heavily influencing our genes, which we thought were these determinants of so much of our health and our behaviors and so on. So given that, can you make the case for our listeners about the importance of understanding the importance of understanding our individual gene variants as risk factors for our health status?
So I agree with you, and I don't see it as risk factors. I see it as something else. I see it more as what you prioritize, right? Because I agree with you. It's more than 80%. The CDC says that of our $4 trillion healthcare budget, 90% is spent on chronic disease.
Wow.
$3.6 trillion of things that we don't need to have, that are all rooted in all of what you said, right? So the reality is that our DNA is ancestrally not grandma and grandpa. It's 200,000 years old, between 200 to 250,000 years old. So our reality is a tiny blip in time versus the reality that we're designed for. So imagine the habits of 200,000. Modern agriculture is 10,000 years old. Farming, right? That's also a blip. The 190,000 years prior to that, those are the habits and the environment and the food and the sun exposure and everything that we are designed and wired for, which is why we still learn about, oh, we have this response because cavemen used to be scared of wolves attacking them in caves. Yeah, because we still are wired for those behaviors. They happen for so long. So given that context, drop it in today's reality, everyone's going to be sick unless you're doing everything right. So all we're saying is, if we know we're in this sort of cesspool of toxic exposure in every way possible, if you can figure out what jobs your body's already doing well and what jobs your body's not going to do well, you can prioritize. You can focus. Here's the thing I'm going to do, because the majority of us aren't going to do everything. The majority of us can do, the time, the budget, the everything. I mean, you look like you're ready to audition for the next James Bond movie, right? But not everybody has the ability to be like a true biohacker and as healthy as you, right? So what do you focus on? Where do you prioritize? What job does your body not do well? That's really what it comes down to. We know if you don't focus, you're going to get sick. This is why 50% of Americans are expected to have cardiovascular disease. 50% of Americans are expected to have cancer. So you turn to somebody, one of you is getting either it's like optional, flip a coin. Why? That wasn't the reality 100 years ago, right? So all we're saying is figure out what thing in your body isn't doing a good job and focus there, right? Prioritize whatever your goal is. I need to lose weight. I have brain fog. I don't have good relationships. Whatever's going on, you can fix it by prioritizing the cellular function that's suboptimal. Because all of us have things that we do well and things that we don't do so well. So you don't need to do the things that are doing well. Let that you, as an example, have amazing mitochondrial function, right? When we look at your genetics,
really,
yeah, based on your genetics, you're
I missed that.
so yeah, your superoxide dismutase pathway and your GPX, as we call it, are perfectly aligned, and they're the best possible versions. So you're doing really, really well there.
I
So
always
this thing
knew that
that you
my
talk about,
superoxide gene and GPX genes were perfectly aligned. I've been told that often since I was a young child.
yeah. Well, and this is the thing that you tell people about. If you focus on, innate cellular health and mitochondrial resilience, it's very difficult to get sick.
Mhm.
And so you're doing really well there. Somebody might not be doing well there, and then all of a sudden they shouldn't be running on a treadmill every day and putting themselves in oxidative stress, and they maybe need to be supplementing with urolithin A or something else, that which I learned from you, by the way, that
Oh, cool.
supports. Yeah, yeah. So now all of a sudden, so that's really the key. I don't think it's about understanding disease risk. I think that thinking about genetic interpretation is outdated. That's still around pharma funding research to make a pill.
Yeah.
I think it's more about knowing that we're all exposed and just where do you prioritize? Because you can't
Yeah.
do everything.
Beautifully said. Now let's make the situation even more complex by introducing the idea of trade-offs. There's a quote I love from a famous economist and academic and writer named Thomas Sowell, and political commentator. And he said, there are no solutions in life, only trade-offs. And obviously he's looking at this from a political and economic and government regulation lens, but I think there's a lot of truth to this idea on many different levels. And I think it also is related to our human genetics of every species. I think we have a tendency to look at things from a simplistic perspective where we say, let's say this particular gene variant is bad because it increases your risk of so-and-so.
Right.
And yet, I think we're finding in a number of cases, and I suspect 10 or 20, 50 years from now, we will have a much more sophisticated understanding of what I'm about to say. But we're finding in many cases that some gene variant that might increase a tendency for one particular bad outcome might actually have a trade-off where it was protective against something else, or provided a benefit in a different context. If you look at this from the perspective of natural selection and millions of years of evolution, why would evolution have selected for all these gene variants that just provide all these bad outcomes? It makes much more sense that there would be trade-offs present in these things, that a certain variant or set of variants might increase risk for one particular outcome, but be protective or provide a benefit for survival in some other area. An interesting example of this was that I remember studying was in the context of genes that increase risk of schizophrenia, and that oftentimes they run in artists and musicians' families, and so the people who tend to be more creative, see things from like very outside the box perspectives, tend to be doing art and music and contributing that kind of creative product to the world, tend to also be more susceptible to schizophrenia. And so there's an interesting dynamic at play there where kind of opening up, let's say, I imagine it as like opening up certain ways of functioning of the brain simultaneously are providing a benefit and increasing risk for some particular bad effect. And you could look at the obesity gene obviously through this context too. Like in the modern world, it's like it's increasing your propensity to become very overweight. In a context of an environment where food is scarce, that's hugely protective to be able to not stop eating as much, to be more inclined to pile on excess body fat, will help you survive in an environment where food is less common, right? Mm-hmm. So I'm curious, given that I just dabble in this area of genetics, but given that you are dedicated to it, what sorts of trade-offs do you see in this landscape?
Yeah, so you're right on. And this is where particularly, so there's two big areas where I see this a lot: female hormone health, which I would say is the biggest gray area in medicine right now that needs the most support. It's like, yeah, you're supposed to have problems. You're hormonal. Don't worry about it. That's kind of the answer women get right now when it's genetically so black and white and so easy to resolve all this stuff. The other one is the thing that you mentioned, mood and behavior in the brain. So what we learned in our research, we were patient facing with 7,000 people. So we sat and interviewed 7,000 people, sometimes for a single hour, sometimes for many months, depending on what problem we were trying to deal with. And so we learned their actual behaviors that are driven by their neurochemicals, that are driven by their genomic map. And what we learned was everyone that said anxiety, depression, addiction, burnout, procrastination didn't have those problems. There's a fraction again where it's innate. You have call it a chemical imbalance, and you have this thing. The majority, the chronic stuff, doesn't exist. What it is a context misalignment. So just like you said about the artist, so there's a gene called COMT that clears neurochemicals. It also clears hormones, by the way. It's also the tail end of methylation, your anti-inflammatory response. So it does multiple jobs. So if you have the very slow version, a couple things happen. It's very easy for you to be that sort of subject matter expert that binges, that does very deep analytical work, because your neurochemicals stay around for longer and you can deep dive and binge on stuff. And people do actually end up having binging tendencies when their comp is slow and if their dopamine expression is high, so they stay in that pleasure or reward experience. It also causes anxiety because you get stuck in the feeling. It doesn't go away. So Adra2B drives your noradrenaline response. And when you get stuck in an adrenaline response around negative stimulus, and you kind of imprint, like truly imprint, like tattoo this feeling, and that becomes your memory of it, is the feeling as opposed to the information. And when you see that person again or in that room again, you actually remember that feeling, and it creates this anxiety response. But that same exact thing is what allows you to binge and come back with 10 pages of work that your colleagues saw as like surface level, right? The same thing in your hormones. So we have a lot of women who we try to speed up their COMT because it allows them to clear toxic estrogen. So SAMe, sulforaphane, there's supplements that you can give that speed up COMT and help clear this stuff, right? It ends up speeding up their neurochemicals too. So all of a sudden, this person who was used to being this, I write 20 pages at a time, is all of a sudden thinking like this. Right? And they end up having addictive tendencies because they can't get enough pleasure out of what they're doing. And they don't know how to deal with that. Or they become highly reward seeking, or they become depressed because the world sucks and they can't get pleasure for long enough. So there is a trade-off. And this is where that map, so take a step back. Who am I? Right? What job is my brain designed for? And if I'm in that context, I'm going to thrive and feel incredible. If you take this and put me somewhere else, what my parents told me to do or where I ended up for whatever reason, I'm going to crash and burn, and I'm going to start using words like anxiety, depression, burnout, procrastination, because I'm not aligned to what I was designed for. And we see when we're working with executives, couples, families, we see so many times over and over and over again that somebody has this innate superpower that they're wired for, and they're in the wrong place at the wrong time, and they're totally burdened. Right. And then we teach them what they're good at, and then all of a sudden they thrive. So yeah, so that happens all the time. The same exact thing that drives a great benefit can be your kryptonite if you're in the wrong context.
Yeah. To some, I think that's beautifully explained. And to some extent, all of us are in the wrong context.
Yeah.
In terms of through looking at modern human life through an ancestral lens, we all have a context mismatch with what we're designed for. Obviously the modern diet, the modern lifestyle, the lack of hormetic stress, lack of sun exposure, lack of tribe and community and tight, family bonds and shared meaning and traditions and with one's community. I mean, we have so many of these kind of context mismatches that are creating a problem. And then you add further to, you can break things down in this very specific way that you're describing, where you're talking about the individual's specific proclivities and needs to be healthy and happy and high functioning, and the mismatches that those individuals might have even within that cultural context.
Yep, for sure. We see it all the time. The big area where we've recently been doing that is with athletes. And it's really cool because you think that these people are the top and they're high performing, top 1/2 of whatever fraction of a percent to get to where they are, but they're really struggling mentally because mama wants tickets, friends want a new car, and they're not, so, so they've trained their bodies, but they haven't trained their minds,
Mhm.
right? And nobody ever told them what their minds needed to be ready for. And so there's a huge context problem, is all of a sudden they went from like the student to this celebrity to this provider, and their problems are different,
Mhm.
a completely different context. And so now a big part of what the coaching we do is teaching celebrities how to be a leader, how to like deal with, how to understand that those people don't experience the world the way you do, and can't understand what you're thinking. They can't understand your problems. Right?
Mhm.
They don't see it, they don't get it. So, and that's just one context. We can talk about hundreds of them, right?
Yeah, yeah, very interesting. I want to talk about one other thing that comes to mind, and then I want to delve into my specific
Sure.
reports, or I want you to delve into my reports. Um, that is the idea. I know there are different companies with different genetic testing technologies and approaches to this sort of analysis that exist out there, and there's some discussion of single allele um, uh, analysis versus polygenic approaches. Do you have any thoughts on those two approaches? Well, I guess first explain to people what those are. I might be using the,
Yeah.
the wrong terminology there, but
Yeah.
explain what those are and how you perceive that landscape.
So tests, unfortunately, are designed, most consumer genetic tests are not designed for the consumer. They're designed for the buyer of the data, who's the real customer. Because you're going online buying some tests for a few $100s, and the data buyer is willing to pay $5,000 for your sample. So who's the product designed for? Who's the real customer in that equation? And so what
But
they were
what does that mean? Who's buying the data?
put, usually pharma. So if you look at, for example, 2019, 23andMe did their big fundraising round, and they raised $300 million from GlaxoSmithKline. Why does Glaxo care to give them $300 million?
Ah,
Because they want access to every single genetic sample that comes through the door. And their intention is to build personalized medication, genetic therapies, which will solve rare genetic problems, but they're trying to put chronic disease into those same buckets. It's
of
not where
course.
they fit, right?
Well,
Things
and
like
yeah, and not to get too deep down the rabbit hole, but of course, if you understand the distinction between a desire to cure diseases versus a business just trying to make money, then
yeah,
it explains a lot of that behavior.
yep. And so now you have this landscape of, once I test your DNA never changes. So the business isn't that great. One-time customer. How do you make it great? You sell data. And then it becomes a license and it keeps going. So the tests are designed around exactly what you said. These single SNPs are what is called like a spelling mistake. So each gene is thousands of letters long, and there's supposed to be a T in this exact location, and sometimes it's a C. And now that gene doesn't do its job properly. That's a SNP. There's also something called an insertion or deletion, which means a whole paragraph is missing, or there's an extra paragraph. So imagine the difference between reading a book with a spelling mistake or half the page is not there,
Mm.
right? So these data dumps are only looking for the SNPs. They're just looking for a mass SNP list. You have to look at the insertion and deletions to be more precise. There's also something called a copy number variation, which means you don't even have the gene, or you have an extra copy of it. Imagine you're reading a book and the page is missing, or two pages are missing. How much can you understand the instruction? So this is, by the way, you have this happening in your detox pathway.
Mm.
Really, really important. One of the most important jobs you could be doing, which is protecting your cells from toxicity, you don't even do when it comes to your gut. I'm just going to double check I'm saying that properly, but I remember seeing that. So now that's where, first of all, what you even test for is so much more important if you're testing for the buyer of the test who wants a healthcare outcome versus the buyer of the data who just wants a bunch of SNPs. But then looking at it, like you said, polygenically, it's not this gene does this gene does this gene does this. The body does not work like that.
Mhm.
If I tell you this gene metabolizes your progesterone into testosterone, now go do something about it. Well, what about, do I make DHT? Do I convert it into estrogen? Do I, so exact, for example, we work with a lot of NHL players because we're in Toronto, mecca of NHL training. And a lot of them come to us saying, I don't know what's going on, but I got man boobs, gynecomastia. Then when we roll it back, we find out that they've been given androgens or testosterone treatment, and they have a really fast version of the gene that converts testosterone into estrogen. So whatever testosterone you give that guy, he's just converting it into estrogen, which eventually leads to gynecomastia and beautiful hair and beautiful skin and mood issues. So
Trade-offs. At least you have beautiful hair and beautiful skin.
Yeah, exactly. That's the trade-off, right? So now all of a sudden the pathway or the full cascade polygenic is much more important than a single, hey, what does testosterone do? Right? Well, let's look at this guy's testosterone genes. No, you have to understand the full cascade because the body has other steps. It's a chain, right? But more of a baton pass, I should say. So now when you look at it that way, you can reverse engineer how the body works and start to make panels that actually inform what we already understand biologically, as opposed to what does each gene mean? I'm trying to interpret that and jam that into the way the body works, which is why chronic disease and aging and performance was never resolved with genetics, because that you can't make those two things fit. So this is what functional genomics is in a nutshell. It's like start with the body first, start with biology first, only focus on systems and pathways, forget about the 25,000 genes. There's literally only 100 that matter when it comes to functional pathways, and then test for the right thing. And if we look at you, for example, GSTM1 is a gene that is highly protective of the gut. You don't have it. So this pathway instructs how your body utilizes glutathione around the gut. And you don't have the instruction. It's missing from that cascade. So when it comes to pesticides, chemicals, drying agents, the packaging that's seeping into your foods, the machines that the organic cookies were processed on, still coming through heavy metal, still cleaned with chemicals every once in a while, your gut allows that to directly enter your gut tract and into your bloodstream. You're supposed to block some of that stuff, which leads to a couple things. Gut dysbiosis, because there's so much inflammation being caused by these insults, leaky brain, neural inflammation, overall head to toe inflammatory insult to the cells, because this stuff is meant to be filtered by the gut. Your body's not doing it. And there's so much more to filter than what we were designed for to begin with, right? So now the flip is also true, where when it comes to the traffic cops that are in the blood, GSTT1 is the gene, you're doing really well there. You got both copies, mom and dad, both gave them to you. So it's getting in, but you do a good job of kind of sending it to the liver to metabolize. When it comes to first line of defense of the lungs, you're somewhat 50%. So mold, chemicals, airborne inhalation type toxins, that's where you're doing not so good, but not horribly. So your focus around, again, how do you prioritize? You have to prioritize if it comes to not being inflamed and blocking toxins. It's the gut for you, right? That's your number one red flag. Now if I look at, okay, now that the stuff got in, we know something's seeping in, how well does your body deal with it? So methylation is multifold, and a lot of genes do more than one thing. This is another thing we don't understand about genes. Here's the heart gene, here's the satiety gene, here's the obesity gene. Typically they do many more things than just the one thing they're studied for. So methylation is your anti-inflammatory response, but it's also the regulator of your gene expression. So one of the very first things you said is, here's what version of what genes I have, but now based on my environment, based on my behavior, based on how hard I worked out today, the genes might express a little bit less or more. They actually do their jobs a little bit beyond what the instruction is, or a little bit less, depending on the epigenetic exposure. So methylation is what turns those dials, that is communicating constantly between you and whatever the inputs are to adjust. So your methylation, if we were to only look at the storied MTHFR gene, which everyone calls the methylation gene, you're doing really, really well. Best version, right? So that's normally where the story ends. But methylation isn't a single gene, it's a full cascade. It's, again, a baton pass, or 6 or 7 steps of taking things like B9, B12, folic acid, folinic acid, and converting them into what they need to be, and making these, allowing your body to methylate properly. So where you're not doing well is everything that's supportive, which means that the way you, for example, metabolize B12, you actually need it sublingually under your tongue. So the ability for your gut to absorb B12 is not that good. It's like minus 60%. right? So your ancestors probably didn't eat as much beef as they did maybe sheep and lamb and things that are methylated and broken down right in the mouth, which is why grandma says chew your food, right?
Yes.
Yeah, where you're also not doing well is the supportive. So MTHFR, this core foundational methylation gene, which is what everyone talks about. SHMT1 is what supports it, and you're not doing well there. So whereas people are told to take folinic acid or methylated B complexes, you actually you actually need folinic acid, as it's called, right? Not folic. Your body doesn't do much with folic. You need folinic, which is not often used. But for you, very specifically, that's what you need to get your methylation on point. And then your body responding as appropriately as it should be. So just those two very specific things for you can completely change how your body manages inflammation, how your body is signaling from whatever the inputs are to what genes should be expressing. And that can become hyper efficient as opposed to right now, it might be a little bit off if you're not already doing these things.
Got it.
Right?
Okay, so keep going with maybe some other specifics of my report, and then after we talk about me, we'll talk about maybe a couple more general topics and things that your reports talk about.
Sure. So another thing that stands out is your vitamin D pathway. So vitamin D to us is really important. Of the 22,000 genes that make up your genome, 2,000 require vitamin D to express properly, to function properly. So this key micronutrient, which is actually a hormone, as we know, is the sort of catalyst that makes these genes do their job. What you do, and this is why of all the micronutrients, usually there's a single gene that converts vitamin C, zinc, vitamin A into its form and gets your body using it. Vitamin D has 3 genes because first you need to get it from the sun, D2, convert it to D3, which you don't do at all, right? Horribly. So your ability to actually metabolize and take vitamin D and put it into the active form, you don't do well at all, minus 70%. Then you need to transport it. So once it's in the blood, you actually need to chug it along and put it on this transport bus or whatever it is and get it to the cell. You also don't do that so well. So minus 50%. Then once it gets to the cell.
By the way, explains why I really do much better when I live in a place where I have a lot of sun exposure. And my skin can tolerate, I have a lot of Mediterranean and Middle Eastern ancestry and some North African ancestry, and my skin, I can tolerate hours, especially with a good diet. My skin can tolerate hours and hours of daily sun exposure, even here in Costa Rica in very hot tropical sun. And I definitely feel my best when I get a ton of sun exposure.
Yep. So you are designed for that. So this again goes back to what you're saying, the trade-offs, right? So in the wrong environment, this is a crutch. In the right environment, like my ancestors were Mediterranean and they were agricultural, they were overdosing on vitamin D. Mm-hmm. So you're actually designed to mitigate that overdose of too much vitamin D, which is potentially toxic, mm-hmm. right? So now the last step is once it gets to the cell, you have to bind it. And you also don't do that well. So minus 70%, minus 50%, minus 50%, which means exactly what you just said, that you need way more than the average person. But not only do you need a high dose, you need multiple doses during the day because you can't transport it and bind it fast enough. So if I give you 10,000 IU in the morning, you maybe only got to use 1,500 of it. You need to take like 4,000, maybe 3 times, which is why you feel so good in the sun. This could be the reason why go live in New York for a year and you're going to get seasonal mood issues, depression, sure. Because again, vitamin D supports all of your biological function, right? So from mood to bone to like hormones, so like everything gets affected, and all of a sudden, if you don't have enough, system failure, right? Everything starts to fall apart. So this for you is a key area of focus where everything sort of, all the ships rise, right? The tide, the vitamin D tide.
Tell me more about the various ways my genetics are screwed up and killing me.
Okay, let me find something else here. So I'm going to go back to another area. I'm going to look at your hormones. And this is an area where most genetic tests don't report on hormones because if you don't look at the cascade, there's really not much to say. Each gene on its own is not actionable. So you do a very good job of converting progesterone into testosterone. So there's a lot of free-flowing testosterone. Uh, you do not convert it into estrogen, which, depending on what your goals are, is potentially good. You do make a lot of DHT, which is sort of the manly man version of testosterone, and you clear it quite well. And I'm going to tell you what this all means in a second. And you are really efficient in binding androgen. So you have this prototype of, you make everything you need to make. You do not convert it into estrogen, but you get rid of it a little too fast. So you have this like use it or lose it body. If you decide to push yourself and go to the gym, you will look like Captain America. You won't look like The Rock. You also won't look like Spider-Man. You're going to have the prototypical, the nice juicy pecs, nice muscles, not massive because there's no estrogen. Estrogen
Have
will
you been
actually
checking out my Facebook profile? Tell the truth. Talking about my nice juicy pecs. Jeez. Have you been looking at more than my DNA report?
Well, I was going to
I'm
ask you
getting a
where you
little
get your waxing
suspicious.
done because, I've been having issues there. Yeah, so and that's what, so your hormones speak to that. Your hormones speak. So most people misunderstand that the size actually comes from estrogen. The ability to deadlift 400 pounds, you're not going to get there, but you will be able to very effectively get to the gym, put on muscle, get lean and fit, see all that striated, ripped fiber, right? But when you stop, it's going to go away.
So I have a couple things I want to share on this. It's very true, first of all, what you just explained. My wife is totally different. My wife is a genetic freak when it comes to physique. I mean,
Right.
she barely works out. She does like yoga and she surfs with me, but as far as consistency of weight training or any other type of like intense exercise, there's no consistency. And she's like got amazing six-pack abs all the time. She's got like muscular delts and arm muscles. Girls come up to her all the time. They're like,
Yeah.
oh my God, how do I get your physique? You must have an incredible workout routine. And I just start dying of laughter every time it happens. I'm like, she barely works out, and it's all just genetic gifts. And then me, I'm like constantly working out and doing a ton of exercise. And if I stop for 2 weeks, it's exactly what you said. Like all of it goes away very fast. And I have to work so hard in order to have an impressive physique. And I'm very much envious of my wife in that regard. One other quick thing that's interesting to note. There's a super famous bodybuilder, widely regarded as one of the maybe the best, or next to Arnold Schwarzenegger, the best bodybuilder of all time, and that's Ronnie Coleman. And when I was young, when I was a teenager and I was into bodybuilding, my brother and I used to watch these pro bodybuilders work out. And there was one video where Ronnie Coleman was talking about how he like doesn't even work out for half the year, like 5 or 6 months of the year. He's like, he doesn't even work out. And mind you, this is an 8-time Mr. Olympia champion, widely regarded as like the best bodybuilder of all time. And he's like, yeah, like half the year I don't even work out. And he goes, yeah, I mean, the way I think about it, it's basically like a car sitting in a garage. And, just because you got the car sitting in the garage not being used doesn't mean it's going to like deteriorate. And my brother and I looked at each other and we're like, what the hell is this guy talking? This guy's a genetic freak, because if I go on vacation for like a month and I stop weight training, I lose 20 pounds of muscle, and this guy's maintaining this mountain of muscle, just muscles on top of muscles for like 6 months without even working out, so speak to your point of genetic differences. And
this comes back to the trade-off. So what you're talking about, this is a unique profile. So some people are androgen dominant like you, some people are estrogen dominant, and some people are co-dominant. They have both, and they have very slow clearance. But what's the trade-off? Androgen dominance is probably the single greatest marker for male longevity, right? When you see the sort of slender, more wiry frame, thinner, easier to not have fat, and what you have, that androgen dominance speaks to longevity. It speaks to 90 years old riding your bicycle,
Great.
right? The co-dominance, especially when you don't clear the hormones, and remember, as you age, as you know very well, your mitochondria deplete, your cells are less resilient, whatever toxicity there is, including hormone toxicity from DHT, which makes you ripped, if you're not clearing it, that's what
And
allows you
causes
to
a receding hairline, though.
that's your receipt. Exactly. Yeah. But you are efficiently clearing it, which means you're probably not going to have prostate issues, probably not going to cause you inflammation. There's enough to kill your follicles, but you still have hair on your head, right? So you'll see when people reach a certain age, when they have that co-dominance and lack of clearance, okay, great. Just like your wife, don't do a thing, eat cheesecake for dinner, and I can see my delts, right? But once you reach that tipping point of my mitochondria depleting, I'm now aging, the aging sets in rapidly. The decline is rapid because you have this toxic load that you never dealt with. You have call it your the estrogens to lead to estrogen toxicity in women, right? The androgens to lead to androgen toxicity in men. And then all of a sudden you're not dealing with that because your whole life you thought I'm amazing and I'm healthy and people judge themselves on what they look like outwardly. They don't measure enough what's going on the inside to understand what's really going on. And so, anyways, trade-off again. Trade-off is put on muscle and it stays. I've built something, right? As opposed to you need, and I, by the way, the same thing, need to maintain something. For us, longevity. We're gonna, as long as we do a little bit of physical and maintain whatever we're doing, easy to stay youthful as we age. Those people start to deteriorate rapidly, but there's things they can do if they know that early enough. They start to turn the right dials and focus on their priorities, like we said earlier. So everyone has their plus and minus to these different profiles, right?
Very interesting. Okay, are there any other notable areas of my genetics that you can embarrass me about?
Well, one place where you're actually doing really, really well is cardiovascular. Well, one area you're doing really well, one area you're not doing so well. So your ability to utilize nitric oxide is almost the worst possible, which by the way, also plays into that maintenance, right? You need to stay androgenized. You need to keep pushing your muscles in your body. Otherwise you lose it. So nitric oxide for you is a problem. You should probably be supplementing. There's a great product. In fact, it's sitting right here. This is not a purposeful plug. It has nothing to do with me. I just found it works really well. Pneuma nitric oxide. I'll send it to you after. It works incredible. The other end of it is the arteries. Most cardiovascular disease doesn't happen in the heart. It's usually the arteries. They get calcified, plaque buildup, cholesterolemia, all this stuff goes on. You lose that they become more stiff, more rigid, right? So you have almost the best quality endothelium, which is extremely rare. You're like top 5-7% of the population.
I knew it. I've also been told that I have amazing endothelial since I was a young boy.
Well, whoever you've been talking to has some incredible insights.
They're very intuitive.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So essentially, this inner lining of your blood vessel is like stainless steel.
Wow.
So it's very hard to get inflammation, which is the root cause of cardiovascular disease. So when you get inflammation in your endothelium, which is so easy to get because there's so many toxins, then your body will actually use cholesterol as like this Vaseline, or it's a hormone to reduce the inflammation. That's why the cholesterol gets sent there. And as it meets the toxicity, it oxidizes and hardens. And that's when you get that buildup. And that's when you get labeled with a disease and take Lipitor, the number one prescribed drug, not because everyone has cholesterol problems, because everyone has a toxic burden they can't cope with. Right. And the majority of people don't have good quality endothelium because they didn't need it. It wasn't a problem. You are highly resilient. So as long as you're dealing with your nitric oxide dosing well, it's highly, highly unlikely for you to ever have a cardiovascular problem. You're doing really, really well there.
Okay, but how do I go from stainless steel in my endothelium to adamantium, like Wolverine in X-Men?
So there is something you could do.
Okay.
If you do, for nitric oxide is one. There's a product, again, nothing to do with us, third party. It's called Arterisol. It's actually a supplement, but it's clinically studied in the same way a drug is to actually build your endothelium. and to make it super. And so you would literally smoking till you're 100, saying, "Here's my secret to how do I live to 100." Right?
Okay, but in all seriousness, all those things you just mentioned would obviously be more important for somebody with weak
Yes.
endothelium.
It's like mandatory. If you have there's 6 locations on the 9p21 gene where we're looking for this variant, and it's where these A's, they're supposed to be A's, become G's. So we call it how many G's? You have 1, which is really, really good. The majority of people we talk to have between 4 to 6. So majority of people are set up for cardiovascular disease, which is why it's the #1 killer in the world today. 50% of Americans are expected to get it. So yes, for most people, this is a need. It's not a how do I get better? No, you actually need this just to maintain and not get sick. Right?
Okay, let's go over maybe, I don't know, what do you think? 2, 3, 4 more specifics of my genetics, and we're doing this for everybody listening. Obviously, this is not just for my own personal benefit. I've already looked in depth at my reports. It's great actually to have Kashif giving me his insight in addition to what's in the reports there, and kind of taking me through all this systematically and explaining it step by step. It's wonderful. But for everybody listening, the point of this is not to just talk about my genes. Obviously, it's to show you an example of the kinds of insights that you can glean from doing this kind of genetic analysis, especially with Kashif's company, the DNA company. So you're getting a sort of guided tour of the landscape of what these genetic reports can tell you as far as your own genetic risks for particular things.
Yeah, and I think what you're describing, the key is interpretation, because anyone can go test their DNA, but how do you apply it to the problem you're trying to solve? Right. So what we're saying is, with what we've curated, we think you name any of the conventional problems that we're dealing with today, we can inform a direction on that. Like, what do you actually do about it? Because these are the same functional genes that affect the majority of pathways. So now going to your diet and nutrition, a couple things stand out. First of all, you do uniquely well with starches. So your ability to convert starch into glucose and use it as fuel, most people aren't doing well. You're doing extremely well, to the point where go eat carbs, so you probably don't feel as well. Like there's some people, I remember there's a female athlete we were dealing with that just didn't feel right and couldn't retain her muscle mass if she wasn't eating enough starch and carbs, which is counterintuitive to current health, but she needed it. Your insulin response is also excellent, which speaks to high carb diet. Right? You're designed for a lot of starches and carbs. Doesn't mean you should go eat a bunch of sugar, but it's not as big a problem for you as it is for the average person. You're just doing really, really well there.
And plus a lot of physical activity where I'm depleting glycogen stores in my body constantly. Yeah.
Yep. Where you're not doing well is saturated fats. So you're the opposite of what we hear every day. If you were to go on a keto diet, you might feel great in the first few weeks because ketones start firing, brain's on fire, you're losing fat. 5-6 weeks into it, sluggish, brain fog, low energy, fatigue, wouldn't feel good at all because your body struggles using fat as fuel.
Yeah.
So you have this unique profile, which is a completely counterintuitive to everything you're hearing on every podcast and YouTube show. You're the opposite.
Yeah, exactly. And that obviously matches up with my own personal experience. And again, the layer of doing a lot of exercise also, I feel the difference between whether I've got carbs in my system or not. And obviously we have a large body of evidence showing that in general, moderate to high intensity activity, you perform better when you've got carbs in your diet.
Yeah, for sure. And now, where we said, like, you can ask a question. So if somebody was asking about Alzheimer's and dementia, for example, we might go to look at diet nutrition to understand how that informs Alzheimer's and dementia, because if you're not doing well with your insulin response and your starch response, that could be the trigger that leads to the neural inflammation, that leads to plaque buildup or whatever. We might look at how you deal with cholesterol transport, the thing that you're doing really well. If they're not doing that so well, the ApoE gene, as it's known, that means to accelerated amyloid plaque buildup because you don't transport it well. So it stays there, it sits there. We might look at your gut detox, right? If that's a source of inflammatory insults coming into your body, which means dysbiosis to the gut, that could mean eventual leaky gut, which means toxic substrates that your blood-brain barrier were not designed to protect you from. They were designed to protect you from broken down metabolites that have gone through your gut tract, right? So now all of a sudden, leaky brain, cognitive decline, dementia. So it's not a Alzheimer's gene, right? It's any one of these things can cause dementia. So we have to understand functionally what the body is doing wrong. So now if I go to your brain, one thing that stands out, BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor. There's a phenomenon called epistasis, which is when one gene affects another gene. So BDNF is neuroplasticity in a nutshell, your brain's ability to develop neural pathways and learn things and develop new sort of, highways for information to flow. So your BDNF gene says that you do that really, really, really well. And there's no good or bad here. Really well doesn't mean better than not well. It's just different outcomes, right? Again,
There's no good or bad, but there's awesome, right? I'm in the awesome.
Exactly. Yeah. Just like your pet.
Large and fluffy. How did you describe them? Juicy. Large and juicy. I have large and juicy BDNF in my brain.
Yeah. So now you have this gene called TPH, which is also the optimal version, which epistatically is turning the BDNF off. So, but it doesn't turn all of it off. So if you have bad BDNF, as we call it, again, it's not bad, it's different. It's just the bad meaning the gene isn't efficient. So what is happening? You still are efficient at the neuroplasticity part, but you aren't good with the mood part. So the mood traits that come from having poor BDNF, you probably still experience. And what are those things? When you're have this, call it tunnel vision, when it comes to your neurology, bad BDNF means you do a really, really good job of developing very few pathways. So subject matter expert, right? Don't like to wear multiple hats. But how it affects your mood is everything has a lot of meaning. So call it drama queen response in a nutshell.
Whoa.
Right? Yeah.
Took a turn for the worst here real fast, Kashif.
Yeah.
I'm definitely going to edit this out of the podcast.
Yeah. And so now people that are close to you, again, this can be a very highly functional trait if it's used well. If you give things a lot of meaning, if you're dealing with a client, customer, patient, whatever, you're able to not just surface level say yes or no, but really dive deep because it means a lot to you. It's important, right? You can't, it leads to this, what we call shell shock, hamster wheel spinning, ruminating. I can't stop thinking about it. I can't sleep at night because I can't stop thinking about it, whatever it is. I shouldn't have said this. I should have shown up 5 minutes earlier.
For sure, yeah.
Right? So because of that deep meaning, it can lead to a stress response, a cortisol response. It can lead to friction in relationships, but can also lead to this incredible superpower in your work where you dive deep and become that subject matter expert. And when you write a book, it's mind-blowing. And when I've spoken to you, the kind of stuff that flows out of your mouth is like, how does this guy, where does he keep all of this stuff? Right? So that's what allows you to do that, as opposed to being that high-level jack of all trades, which is also useful in a different context. If you want to be an entrepreneur that runs 7 different businesses, right? So that's how it affects mood. But because you have the good BDNF, it doesn't affect neuroplasticity. So we would say things like concussion, etc., probably not that big of a problem for you as they would be for somebody else, right? Your serotonin is dysregulated, which means that your brain, so we speak of serotonin as sort of a mood regulator. How do I deal with anxiety, depression? Am I responding as appropriate for whatever is going on? Am I over or under responding, or am I right on? So it's harder for you to stay in that middle. And the mechanism of that is that your brain is challenged in prioritizing stimulus, whatever's going on, which means irritable, distractible. When you were younger, people might have said ADHD, right? Because you're jumping. It's not that you can't pay attention. It's you're paying too much attention to everything that doesn't need attention, right? Stop making that noise with your mouth. Don't interrupt me. I'm busy. We could have done this tomorrow, like irritability around stimulus.
Yeah.
It also leads to this hyper awareness of detail because you are so stimulated by things you don't need to be. So when you're reading an agreement or a book or speaking to someone, the detail, the reading between the lines and understanding it, other people won't get it at that level. So this can lead to a couple things. This deep superpower of things have a lot of meaning, right? And I'm this deep subject matter expert, and I see every little detail and nuance as I'm diving into this thing. So like the wow factor outcome of that versus I'm trying to work with a team, and we said last week this, and they came back and said, here you go. And you're like, what about this? And what about this? And what about this? And what about this? And they're like, we did it. You're like, no, you didn't do this. And on the top of page 3, it said that. And because the level of detail that your brain is thinking at is 130% of the people around you. And so all of a sudden there's this constant, we call it like a high functioning anxiety, this drive to like, I just need more. It's never enough. Not in terms of like addiction, but more like what you expect, your expectations.
Yes.
Right?
I'm sure there will be some people who work with me and my relationship partners and ex-girlfriends and current wife that can attest to some of what you're describing here.
Yeah. So this is a therapy session for everybody around you. Like, they're not crazy.
Yeah.
So now what you're doing really well is your ability to deal with trauma and negative stimulus. So there's the shell shock that I can't stop thinking about it, and it means a lot, but there's no feeling attached to it. So it's not trauma, right? So car accident, fight, you remember what happened, but you may not remember what it felt like, right? So it's like, it's not holding the grudge per se. Let's just say that, right? Letting go, not holding the grudge. Yeah, I get it. I feel it. This means a lot, but I don't care. Let's just get it done.
Yeah.
Right? You're not bothering me, right? Versus pain, trauma, like, I can't believe this is happening again. You don't care about me. That type of emotional response is not likely to happen from you.
Yes, agreed.
Yeah. And now your dopamine response is the maximum possible. So the density of your dopamine receptors, ultra dense, which means it's very easy for you to experience pleasure, and the intensity level is very high. So that speaks to, again, trade-off, which is some people are going to call you flaky and not interested because it's so easy for you to experience pleasure that you don't really need to pursue it. It's like, tell me about this TV show. I don't really care, right? Let's go work on this investment. I'm not interested, right? I'm doing what I'm doing. But the thing that you do enjoy and that you found that pleasure from, it's like binge, dive deep, can't get out of it, stuck. Because the intensity level is so high and your clearance is also a little slow. So you get stuck in that thing, which leads to great outcomes. Now imagine having this deep meaning to your work and finding the thing that you actually have passion for and getting stuck in a binge modality and seeing every little detail and nuance as you're going along that way, what that could lead to. But also take all that and put it in a different context, it would fry your brain. Right? This is why so many people are burdened with anxiety, depression, addiction, and burnout, and all these other things, because you are wired for very unique work that doesn't fit in the standard, go out there in the workforce and do your thing. Right?
Yes, agreed.
So, yeah. So the one last thing I'll say is because your dopamine levels are so high and because you're so used to things being good, that when the good is taken away, acute anxiety response. So it's not a chronic everyday. It's not call it trauma. It's more like you just removed what I'm used to, and I'm not used to being down here. Right? So I don't know how to deal with this down here. I might not get out of bed today. Right? Acute response, short term, periodic, when the good, and it's not so much about adding the bad, it's more about taking the good away. Right? COVID lockdown, can't see anybody. What am I going to do? Anxiety, acute anxiety response, right? Can't think for 2 days. That type of thing. So, so now understanding this map and then we can spend 2 hours just talking about your brain, right? Just with these 5 or 6 genes. So now imagine, here's how I perceive the world. Here's how people perceive me. Right now, all of a sudden, the alignment and the removal of friction and finding your path, and this is what we do every day with all these people that we work with and coaching, etc. And they end up thriving. We are truly designed to do certain things, and we're all doing the same thing for the most part, and that's why most of us are doing well. Right?
Yeah. So well explained, Kashif. Really, really great stuff. If you were in my shoes and you had my genetic trade-offs, sets of variants that I have, and everything you just outlined there. What would be maybe your top 2 or 3 things that you'd want to prioritize as far as practical strategies to address what's going on there?
So I would say sauna is a big thing for you,
Mhm.
like minimum 3 times a week, because it promotes BDNF levels and neuroplasticity, along with low intensity exercise like yoga, stretching. And by the way, stretching activates the androgen receptor. So that use it or lose it problem you have, if you
Mm.
stretch regularly, it's easier to maintain the muscle, by the way. The
Okay.
bigger the muscle that you're stretching, the better it is for you. So low intensity yoga type stuff and sauna, really good for BDNF levels, right? The other thing is,
And
this is like
the stretching is also related to the BDNF or
a
the
low intensity movement, like yoga, Pilates type stuff,
Okay.
walking, right? Just saying that you end up stretching in those types of things, right?
Okay.
Um, so the
And
other thing
and
is
and you said low intensity exercise
low intensity exercise.
is
Yeah.
like, you mean steady state cardio endurance exercise?
Well,
As
I mean more like picture yoga,
Okay.
right? When I say
And
intensity, I mean not running out of breath and moving your body. So you still need, this has nothing to do with your weight training. You still need to do that.
yeah.
This is more like in the evening, work is done, signaling to the body some kind of movement.
Hmm.
And that evening movement, because our ancestors used to walk around, they'd eat, walk around, they'd play with their kids. There was nothing to do other than those types of things.
Yeah.
So your brain is waiting for that physical low intensity movement to signal. First of all, this is going to help you sleep also.
Hmm.
It's going to signal BDNF production. It's going to push your clock along, because if you have bad BDNF, your internal circadian rhythm also doesn't work that well. It's one of the genes that triggers circadian rhythm. So this will help you fall asleep. This will help you stop thinking about what happened during the day and park that stuff, right?
Okay.
Um,
So low intensity exercise, stretching in the evening is going to boost BDNF levels at that time?
yeah, and sauna in the evening.
Okay.
Yeah. And going back to it, starting your day with sun and vitamin D.
Hmm.
That will actually support the BDNF. And it will support that clock, right?
Fortunately,
Um,
most mornings I start my day by surfing for a couple
yeah,
hours in the sun.
yeah. So that's working,
Yeah.
right? Yeah. So the other thing that stands out, your serotonin can disrupt the sleep cycle. Not so much, and I can't fall asleep, but I can't stay asleep.
Hmm.
Because just like we know, and just you're asking what are a few things you can do. I'm assuming, we didn't get into this, but I'm assuming that the second half of your sleep probably isn't as good as the first half. And why I'm assuming
Yeah.
that, because melatonin puts you to sleep. We know that. Serotonin wakes you up.
Mm.
And how does it wake you up? Sunlight triggers serotonin binding. Let's get out of bed. I'm actually supposed to be awake now. We know your serotonin is dysregulated. We know you're constantly responding to every stimulus. And in our current reality, which is it's too hot, too cold, weird noise, hubby pulled on the blanket, all this stuff going on, your brain doesn't know time to get up. Oh no, go back to sleep. Time to get up. Oh no, go back to sleep. So you need to eliminate stimulus in your sleep, which means heavy weighted blanket. Your skin, head to toe, is that large sensorial organ that's constantly signaling what's happening at night. Because, like we said an hour ago, your body still thinks that you're trying to not avoid being eaten by wolves in a cave.
Mhm.
Right? We haven't evolved out of that yet. So your skin is signaling, is there something bothersome? Did the temperature change? Did something change?
Mhm.
So that weighted blanket gives you that cocoon, the feeling of safety. But now that you have a weighted blanket, you're going to overheat. So
Mhm.
you need a cooling pad to maintain your body temperature,
Yeah.
right? So it's that combination creates that cocoon, and then zero light leakage, zero stimulus. You probably want a separate blanket.
Super, super important. I have to have a cold, super dark room with no light
Yeah.
leakage. Makes a huge
Yep.
difference. Yeah.
Yep. So that that sleep hygiene routine for you, very, very important, because this is where you make your hormones and make your neurochemicals and clear your toxins and lymphatic drainage and all of that needs to happen, but it won't if you're not sleeping. Right. So that's another thing that stands out from your brain report that points to sleep.
Yeah.
Uh
Is there
last thing,
anything else you'd do for serotonin?
well, so the gene is 5-HTP-LPR, and we know that 5-HTP, the supplement, is a serotonin modulator, right? So you can, if you feel like it's a mood thing during the day, if you want to be less irritable, let's call it, you can take 5-HTP also right before sleeping. It can support it. The other thing I would say is taking like GABA, ashwagandha type items that are keeping you in a sort of deeper wave state that allows you to stay in deeper sleep. That's another big one. So those I'd say are the big ones for serotonin.
Okay.
And then I should say the number one thing is your gut. Your serotonin is made in your gut in that second half of sleep. That's when you actually make it. So if your gut is not healthy, you're not making your serotonin properly, which then becomes a vicious cycle. So, and for you, we know that your gut detox is not the best. So paying attention to enzymes, probiotics, prebiotics, what are you putting into your stomach to begin with? Ultra clean, right? Including packaging and processing, all that stuff. So yeah, focusing on the gut is a big thing that impacts serotonin.
Excellent.
Right? Yeah. So one more thing I can point out is if you want to, if you find that this sort of periodic dopamine, this high dopamine intensity is a problem for you, it's likely not, because you're in a groove and you're doing the work that you like doing. But if you say need to go on vacation, or there's a problem and there's some anxiety inducing legal letter that you're going to have to deal with for the next few weeks. So cold is a great dopamine modulator, cold therapy. So whether it's plunging or
I've
skiing,
figured that out just in the last few months, that cold has a
yeah,
really nice effect on me. Yeah.
yeah. So it's so whether you have really high dopamine or really low dopamine, cold exposure, short bursts of cold exposure, really modulate your dopamine levels, get you to where you need to be.
Yeah.
Right. And all of a sudden when it comes to reward and risk and all these things, you'll be sort of call it appropriate. You're not overdoing it, not underdoing it. You're more of this Zen kind of state.
Yeah. 100%.
Yeah. So that's another one.
I have to say, I've been really surprised at how spot on your analysis has been on so many levels here. Like I didn't think that you would be able to do that level of sophisticated analysis, and I would have expected more of what you said to not be accurate. But
yeah,
almost everything you said, I would say, is pretty accurate.
So
except all the negative stuff. None of the negative stuff was true. All of that was nonsense.
So this has been the challenge, has been interpretation. And why are we able to do this? Genetics and the genetic researchers that built the genetics industry never talked to patients. They studied DNA in a petri dish. And all the products and reports were designed for PhDs to interpret. And that academic block prevented us from doing this kind of stuff, which is, we realized we need to talk to people, like clinically. So we spent 3 years with 7,000 people, one by one. And now I know, first of all, what does the gene actually doing in terms of outcome? Forget about the science. People don't care. Here's what's wrong and how do I fix it? That's all I need to know. Right? And how do I use the gene to inform that? And now, what is the thing that I can recommend? It's one thing to know what's wrong, but how do I fix it? It's by studying both the sick and the healthy. So we studied the people with the 80% and the 20%, like in both buckets. And we learned what people were doing right and what people are doing wrong. And a lot of the stuff isn't that intuitive. Like we just talked about anxiety in like 5 different ways, so it's not just one thing. It's getting down to the biology, removing these labels. These things don't exist. Chronic disease doesn't exist, right? And then fixing the innate biology so that you thrive and all things go away. Everything starts working properly.
Beautiful. Kashif, this is really, I have to say this again, I'm super impressed with this analysis of, you were just amazingly accurate in like 90%, I would say, of what you said here. And maybe the 10% is just my own unwillingness to acknowledge that.
Well, poor BNF usually leads to people being a little bit stubborn. And
there you go. There you go. That's the explanation right there. So forgetting about me for a minute, tell people where they can get the same, how they can go about getting this analysis from your company. And any other details of maybe any special offer you want to link people to. We can put a link for the podcast episode for this page. We'll have it theenergyblueprint.com/DNA Co,
Right.
all one word, DNACO, and let people know what they can get and where they should go to get it.
Yeah, the testing, yeah, I should point out, don't go to the website and pay retail, because we did create a discount for anyone listening. We honor and respect your time and thank you for listening. And so we wanted to do that.
Thank you for
Go
doing that.
to our, yeah, no, we wanted to do that for the audience. So it's theDNAcompany.com/, the energy blueprint. So, right. So go
Beautiful.
just type in theDNAcompany.com/, the energy blueprint, and you'll have a discount. But keep in mind, you'll see the discount at checkout. When you go see the product live, it won't show you a discount. Once you get to the checkout, it will show it to you.
Mhm.
And from there, the way the reports are designed, everything we talked about here today is in the reports. Some of the interpretation, there's some clinical stuff that we're not allowed to deliver, right? It's just regulatory wise. So we know more than what's in the reports.
Mm.
But you can, if you're sort of optimizing and wanting to be the best version of yourself, go through it and you'll be there. If there's something like, my mom had breast cancer, I don't want it, I can't lose these last 10 pounds, like there's some action needed. We do have practitioners that have been trained on functional genomics that can get in and coach you and work with you and dive deeper into the data and then say things that we're not allowed to say sort of direct to consumer because it's clinical in nature. So if you feel you need that, that's available. But for the most part, if you want to learn about yourself, understand again the core of it. What job does my body do well? What job does my body not do well? Prioritize, supplement properly, eat properly, train properly for that thing. It's in the reports. It's all there, right? So just use that code. It's at checkout. You'll see the discount. And anything else you need, we're here. Our team is here to support.
Yeah, and I have to say, just on a final note, as you know, I think from this conversation and the first conversation we had, you can sense like my bias, my skepticism, maybe against, I would say, go so far as to say against the importance of testing for genetic variants, because in the grand scheme of things, it's much more about lifestyle and nutrition and optimizing our microenvironments. Having said that, I would say you've done a pretty damn good job of convincing even me, a hardcore skeptic of the importance of all of this stuff, that there's quite a lot of value here and very good reason to do this. So obviously, everybody listening, you can see all the layers of insights that was gleaned from my genetic test and brilliantly explained by Kashif. I'm super grateful for this, and it's been very insightful for me personally. And I would highly, highly, highly recommend everybody listening to this to go do the same. So Kashif, thank you so much. Thank you for offering a discount to my audience. And thank you so much for your brilliance and your amazing knowledge of this landscape and ability to teach and communicate about it.
It's a pleasure. It was great being here with you.
Yeah. And tell people one final time, what's the website they can go to? It's theDNAcompany.com/the energy blueprint.
Right, exactly. Go there and you'll see a discount at checkout at the last step.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much, Kashif. I look forward to our next conversation. Hey there, this is Ari again. I hope you enjoyed this episode. And again, just a little reminder, you can go get your own DNA analysis through the DNA Company by going to theenergyblueprint.com/DNA. You can get a discount on this whole testing setup. And this is something that I highly encourage you to do. So go grab it.